Today we're going to look at the major types of poetry. So as we look at the major types of poetry, we have names for all of them because they have different formats and different ways that they like to express their descriptions. So when we start off with perhaps the lyric. Now a lyric is going to be a short poem, and almost always it's going to be written from the first person point of view. A lyric is done to express an emotion or an idea, or it describes a particular scene from that first person point of view. It doesn't tell a story. You're not going to see a specific plot line. You're not going to see a specific beginning and end. Most of the times when we consider lyrics, they're often musical. Matter of fact, today's songs that we listen to are written in lyric form. The next type of poetry we're going to look at is called the haiku. It is a traditional Japanese poem that is written in 3 lines. Sometimes the syllables might vary depending upon what part of Japan you're looking at, but the traditional form of a haiku has 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. And almost always it speaks on physical nature, going out into nature itself. So if you look at the example of the haiku, you'll notice there are 5 syllables in the first, 7 in the second, and 5 syllables in the third line. An old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. Splash. Silence again. The next type of poetry we're going to look at is the CINQUAIN. Now, a CINQUAIN is a 5-line poem, and it contains 22 syllables. So when we start off the CINQUAIN, it starts off short, and then it continues on into doubling itself up by twos. So your first line will have 2 syllables, then the second line will have 4 syllables, the third line has 6 syllables, the fourth line has 8 syllables. But then your 5th line, your final line, will only have 2 syllables again. Sometimes you will notice that people have a tendency to repeat the very first and the last lines because they are 2 syllables, but not always. You don't have to do that. The only thing that is required is those 22 syllables broken up in the 2, 4, 6, 8, and 2 syllable form. How frail, above the bulk of crashing water hangs, autumnal, evanescent, wan, the moon. Another type of poetry we have is a sonnet, and usually when we look at sonnet, we name it after the English or the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, a sonnet is a 14-line poem with a very specific rhyme scheme. So with the Shakespearean sonnet, we notice that the poem is written in 3 quatrains and ends with a couplet. So there's a specific rhyme scheme in order to fit that. So when we look at the end rhymes, the last words, how they rhyme is going to be with the first and third lines rhyming and the second and fourth line rhymings, and so on all the way down until the last 2 lines, the 13th and 14th line, those are going to rhyme. So your rhyme scheme is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and then the last 2 lines are GG. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growst. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Usually when you're looking at contemporary poems, a lot of people nowadays like to write what's known as narrative poems, and those are poems that tell stories. They're generally longer than a lyric style of poetry because the poet needs to establish the characters and the plot. There's a general beginning and an end. You need to figure out who your characters are. And so examples of narrative poems we'd have, for example, when we looked at in the previous segment of poetry, To the Raven, you're following along with a character who is going going through the sadness and melancholy of a death that he has just experienced. When you look at The Highwayman or Casey at the Bats or Walrus and the Carpenter, you have characters that you're following along in their conflicts and watching the conflicts being resolved. So it's a longer poem. You need to introduce a character. You need to introduce a conflict. You need to resolve the conflict. Lastly, we're going to look at concrete poems. Now, in concrete poems, the words are physically arranged on the paper to create a picture that relates the content of a poem. So, for example, my poem on the right-hand side is going to talk about a flame, as in fire. And so, therefore, I have created a little flame out of the words. Poetry is like flames, which are swift and elusive. Dodging realization, sparks like words on the paper leap and dance in the flickering firelight. The fiery tongues, formless and shifting shapes, tease the imagination. Yet for those who see through their mind's eye, they burn up the page. Thanks so much for stopping by to learn about different types of poetry. If you'd like to learn more about different types of poetry, if I didn't cover some of them that you'd like to see here, please leave down in the comments section what more you would like to learn about poetry. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. Thanks for stopping by.